an attack on Taiwan would have negative ramifications for Japan. It would require Japan to defend itself militarily. We've seen economic coercion and a massive disinformation campaign against Japan. This is very, very, very similar, if not exactly the same tools that was used on Australia back in 2020 when the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison made the request for an international investigation of the origins of COVID-19. Beijing sees economic tools and economic coercion as a way to bring pain to the economy and change the leaders' thinking about whatever the particular issue is. In the case of Australia, it was backing down from the COVID-19 investigations. In the case of Japan, Beijing wants the Takichi government to back down from its statement. And frankly, I think that they're interested in using economic tools to change the leader of Japan, to erode away her support and find a prime minister that is more conducive to the kind of relations that China would like to have with Japan. This is not good for middle powers and small powers. If Japan can't resist this kind of coercion, and countries like India or Australia or Canada or the United States don't support Japan, what we're going to see is these kinds of tools be used much more often against neighbors of China who really are much more dependent on China than China is on them.
Stephen, I'd like you to stay on with me. Now, well, a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers has introduced a bill in the House that would block the purchase of Chinese chip-making equipment by CHIPS Act grant recipients for 10 years. The bill targets a range of chip-making tools from complex lithography equipment like that produced by Dutch manufacturer ASML to machines that slice and dice the silicon wafers on which chips are printed. Though Chinese equipment is the main target of the legislation, the bill also blocks tools from other nations of concern, such as Iran, Russia, and North Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. Justice Department has charged 4 people in a scheme to illegally export NVIDIA AI chips to China, prompting a key House Republican to call for urgent passage of a chip tracking bill. The legislation, which Molina introduced in May and has 30 co-sponsors and would require location verification for chips, making it mandatory for chip makers to report and share information about potential diversion and look at additional ways to stop U.S. chips from ending up in the wrong hands. The indictment, which the U.S. Department of Justice announced, charges 2 U.S. citizens and 2 Chinese nationals with conspiring to export NVIDIA GPUs to China without requiring licenses. All right, so I have Stephen back with me. Now, Stephen, we're getting our viewers details of this latest development there as well. What would you like to say on that?
So I think we should understand that the competition between the United States and China is very much not only about security, but about technology. Who's going to be able to dominate the new tools of the 21st century, and that's AI and quantum computing. Both of these require the most sophisticated chips. And what we've seen is the United States is really at the forefront in having the most powerful and sophisticated chips that are built mostly in Taiwan. But they're built through a collection of products. And as you mentioned, there's a Dutch company that's really important in terms of lithography. The Japanese are really important in terms of making the wafers. The United States are really the software producers, and Taiwan mixes it all up like a chef and puts this amazing product together. So if the United States wants to continue to be at the forefront and dominate AI and quantum computing, which I think it absolutely does, and it wants to outpace China, then it has to put controls on all the different technologies. And what you didn't mention in your coverage was the movement of engineers as well. People that have worked in this field, if they are allowed to go and work in China and then come back to Australia or the United States or Canada, the knowledge and the techniques will be transferred to China. I think it's important for us to understand what does this all mean. Really, the country that dominates AI and quantum computing are going to really set the set the table of how technologies move for the next 50 or 100 years. What kinds of medicines are going to be produced? What kinds of defense equipment will be produced? AI enables the winner of this race to produce the most sophisticated technologies that can outpace a competitor, and that's the stakes. That's why the U.S. is blocking all of this. But I believe that the United States is willing to work with India and Canada and Australia and other countries that have shared national interests and shared concerns about what an authoritarian state would do with this kind of power.
All right, Stephen. And now, of course, Stephen, there's also another point that must be mentioned here, which is that the bill also blocks tools from other nations of concern, such as Iran, Russia, and North Korea as well. How do you see that?
Well, we've seen growing alignment between these four countries over the past 3 or 4 years. Since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, we've seen China, through third countries, provide technologies to allow Russia's war machine to continue to manufacture the goods that are necessary for war. We've seen alignment with North Korea and Russia in terms of Russia likely providing satellite technology, some other technology for the North Koreans to refine their missile launching systems and their ICBMs, and the reentry technology that is important for these kinds of systems. And we've seen Iran also transfer technologies, in particular drones, to the front line of Ukraine. So these countries really are working together. How well they can work together in this space of technology and semiconductors is important to study. It's also important for us to make sure that they can't cooperate and those technologies are not flooding into their countries so that they can bypass some of the curbs that the United States and other countries are likely to adopt to, again, keep ahead of in the competition over AI and quantum computing.
Stephen, I'd request you to stay on with me. Now, Russia and China have held in-depth talks in Moscow this week, focusing on missile defense and strategic stability. Both countries have agreed to strengthen cooperation in these areas amid concerns over the U.S. plans to develop a missile shield and resume nuclear testing. The discussions also addressed global and regional security risks and ways to minimize them. The two nations expressed satisfaction with the current level of dialogue and committed to further strengthening their bilateral relationship. This meeting comes as the U.S. and Russia face a deadline in February for the expiration of the last remaining nuclear treaty between the two countries. And I have my guest, Stephen, back with me. Now, Stephen, of course, Russia and China have held in-depth talks in Moscow. And, of course, they're focusing on missile defense and strategic stability. I'd like your comments.
So Russia and China are obviously concerned about the growing strength of the United States and its partners, especially since the Trump administration has come back into power. We've seen President Trump really cajole the Europeans and the NATO to spend up to 5% of GDP on NATO defense spending. He's cajoled the Canadians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others. So from Russia and China's point of view, that they need to find ways to cooperate on missile defense, deterrence, but I think it's important for us to also understand that there's limits to their cooperation. Russia does have strong concerns about China's long-term intentions in terms of the Far East. Often in closed-door discussions, there's slips of tongue by Chinese counterparts that talk about Eastern Russia actually being Chinese, and that this should return to China in one day. These are big concerns, and I think the Russians see that there's limits to the cooperation with China, but at the same time they need Chinese aid to continue to prosecute their war with Ukraine. On the Chinese side, they see opportunity as Russia needs a strong Chinese partner, so they're continuing to strengthen their relationship and develop technology exchanges, ensure there's cheap energy going into the Chinese economy, and likely some technology. they're going to be continue to be aligned, but I think there's limits to their alignment. And the importance, I think, is for United States and partners to try to find ways to divide these two states in the way that they work to divide the United States and Canada, Japan and the United States, and India and the United States.
Thank you, Stephen, for joining me on the broadcast. And now a U.S. Treasury official says that Chinese and Indian banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies. The Trump administration imposed sanctions last month on Lukoil and Rosneft in an effort to cut revenues Moscow uses for its nearly 4-year-old war on Ukraine. China and India are the top buyers of Russian oil. According to officials, many entities in both countries are described as risk-averse and acknowledge the importance of their relations with Western countries. I have my guest joining me on the broadcast, Andrew K.P. Leong, China strategist, and he's joining me from Hong Kong. Now, Andrew, this is, of course, a big move. And how do you see the U.S. Treasury official say that Indian and banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies?
Could you repeat the question? Because I was there was a connection disconnect, so I couldn't hear the question very well.
Sure, Andrew, not a problem at all.
Yeah. Right.
Now, we're talking about the U.S. Treasury official who said that Chinese and Indian banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies. So I'd like your comments on that.
Well, I think that the economies of Russia and China have been joined at the hip for a very, very long time, long before the Ukraine war, because Russia is the world's largest, one of the world's largest energy exporter, and China is the world's largest, energy customer. And so the economies, and also not only energy, but agricultural products. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers and, of course, other agricultural products. China also has been the world's largest customer. So I think that the two economies have been joined at the hip for a long time. But because of the war on Ukraine, China doesn't want to be seen to be supporting the war, because the war on Ukraine tramples upon a fundamental principle which China's government has been adhering to, which is national territorial sovereignty. For example, it underlines China's claim over the islands in the South China Sea, and also China's consistent claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. So I think that the Chinese government is unlikely to support this open transgression of this fundamental principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Now, however, unlike the case of India, which started to buy Russian oil in large quantities only after the Ukraine war, China has been carrying out purchases as normal. However, because of the international pressure, China is likely to send a signal to the West that China is helping in a way to help for an early resolution of the Ukraine conflict. This is also helped by China's less reliance on fossil fuel, because over 50% of China's electricity supply is now supplied by green energy, by wind power, solar power, hydropower. Over 50% of China's electricity supply is now accounted for by domestic green energy. So China would be buying less oil anyway from any country. And so I think China is in a good position to buy less oil. Now, as for sanctions, of course, China doesn't subscribe to the use of sanctions, especially indiscriminate sanctions to even Western allies and the world over and other countries in the global south. So I think that China is likely to oppose these sanctions, the use of sanctions as a tool, as a part of the United States long-armed American exceptionalism. So I think that this is a nuanced response. I think that China is treading a thin red line there.
Andrew, I'd request you to stay on with me. I'll come back to you. Now, China and Kyrgyzstan have taken a major step in strengthening their partnership. In Bishkek, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Kyrgyz Foreign Minister Zhinbek Gulabev held their first ever strategic dialogue. Wang said the new mechanism puts into action the understanding reached by both presidents and will boost trust, coordination and cooperation. He added that China is committed to building a community with Kyrgyzstan based on friendship and shared prosperity. Beijing also voiced full support for Kyrgyzstan as it takes over the rotating chair of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, Gulubev reaffirmed Kyrgyzstan's One China stance and said his country is ready to advance Belt and Road projects, expand trade, agriculture and mining ties, and speed up work on the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railway. He also pledged closer cooperation on China's 4 global initiatives and within the UN and China Central Asia framework. Both sides signed a joint statement and a cooperation program for 2026 to 2027. And I do have Andrew back with me. Now, Andrew, how do you see this particular development?
The Central Asia, the landlocked countries, the 5 countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and the 5 landlocked countries are a central link in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the southern part of it, Azerbaijan, also sits right at the threshold of the so-called Middle Corridor, bypassing the land route over problematic Russian territory, but through the Caspian Sea, connecting China's manufacturing and production hub, through rails from Central Asia to Europe. So I think that this is a very important conduit for China's signature project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, these landlocked countries also, they are relatively backward. They're relatively backward because of the lack of infrastructural connectivity. Because they're landlocked, there is no sea access route, and they are in fact very rich in mineral resources, including gold and other rare metals. But for lack of infrastructural facility, they cannot export their wealth, and the economy has been always remained in difficulties. And now China's thrust towards the Central Asian countries opens up huge areas of opportunities at a time of increasingly confrontational geopolitics. And by building the Belt and Road Initiative, which is largely over land, over Central Asia, over Eurasia, to this Central Asian landlocked countries, it bypasses the problematic sea route over the South China Sea, over the Malacca Strait and near Singapore, controlled by the American 7th Fleet, and also through the problematic areas through the Red Sea and so on, which all these sea-based routes are also essential for the importation of China's lifeblood, because China depends on external trade to a much greater extent than the United States. But by pivoting towards the Belt and Road overland routes, including rail transport and pipelines, supplying energy directly to China's internal provinces, it bypasses the choke points. So from various angles, the closer relationship with the Central Asian countries has geostrategic importance. not to mention their position in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is attracting participation from many countries in the Global South as China pivots to the Global South to balance against the tariffs war imposed by the United States.
Appreciate your joining me on the broadcast, Andrew. Thank you. Now, Tonga awaits for its next prime minister after the national election returned most sitting lawmakers to the parliament. The election comes as the king strengthens his influence over foreign affairs and has departed to China in order to improve bilateral relations. The Electoral Commission says that 10 of 17 people's representatives kept their seats along with 8 of 9 nobles. The new prime minister will be chosen later on the floor of the parliament. Tonga is also navigating through growing geopolitical pressure as China, Australia and the United States compete for influence across the Pacific. The island nation remains heavily indebted to China's Exim Bank, with loan repayments now dominating its 2025 budget. Now, China's Ministry of Commerce says that China urges the Netherlands to promptly and effectively resolve issues related to semiconductor production and supply chains. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce spokesperson He Yongquan states that the source and responsibility for the current disruption in the global semiconductor supply chain is because of the Dutch side. Yongquan also says that China welcomes the Dutch government's move to suspend its administrative order regarding Nexperia, as it is a first step in the right direction towards a proper settlement of the issue. And that's a wrap on the China Report. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. US President Donald Trump says he has signed a bill requiring the release of government documents on Jeffrey Epstein. Trump, who had earlier opposed the measure, announces on Truth Social that he has just signed the bill. Senior Pentagon officials, led by Army Secretary Dan Briscoe, arrive in Kyiv to meet President Zelensky and discuss efforts to end the war with Russia. The visit comes as reports emerge of a new peace plan and after a Russian strike kills 26 people in Ternopil. Ukraine says at least 26 people are killed and dozens are missing after Russian drones and missile strikes hit apartment blocks in the Ukrainian city of Ternopil. Officials say nearly 100 are injured as Russia launches hundreds of drones and missiles, damaging energy and transport sites. A Philippine court sentences former Mayor Alice Guo to life imprisonment after finding her guilty of human trafficking. Authorities say Guo, later identified as a Chinese national, ran for office under false Filipino identity. Sudan's army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan says his council is ready to work with the United States and Saudi Arabia to help end the conflict. The statement thanks regional mediators and follows President Trump's pledge to coordinate efforts with Gulf states to stop the fighting. The Israeli military says Hezbollah is violating a ceasefire by rebuilding operations in southern Lebanon near the Israeli border. It says dozens of sites, including headquarters and weapons stores in civilian homes, have been identified around the village of Beit Leaf. Hamas condemns new Israeli airstrikes in Gaza as a dangerous escalation, warning they threaten an already fragile ceasefire. Israel says the strikes respond to a Hamas violation, while medics report at least 25 people killed in the last 24 hours. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman meets members of Congress in Washington as he promotes deepening economic and security ties. The visit follows a lavish White House welcome from President Trump, who again defends him over the 2018 Khashoggi killing. Those are the headlines of the hour, and we start this bulletin in the Indo-Pacific. And Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te has signalled support for Japan as regional tensions in East Asia continue to rise. Earlier today, he shared images of himself having a sushi lunch made with Japanese yellowtail from Kagoshima and scallops from Hokkaido. This social media display comes amid growing friction between Tokyo and Beijing. Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, has recently remarked that any attack on Taiwan can threaten Japan's security and could lead to a military response. China later indicated it may ban Japanese seafood imports in its ongoing dispute over Taiwan. Moreover, the Taiwanese government has faced similar import bans from China in recent years, targeting products such as pineapples and fish. Taipei has characterized these actions as part of a broader pressure campaign. Meanwhile, at a briefing in Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has reiterated its position that Taiwan is part of China and said that it remains a non-negotiable stance. Following this ongoing tension between China and Taiwan, Taiwan's leadership has called for stronger support for Japan, including more travel and increased purchases of Japanese goods. Officials have said that such actions would help demonstrate friendship between the two sides. Joining us now is Dmytro Burstev. He's a junior research fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies in Ukraine, joining us from Taipei. Thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It is a pleasure to have you. Dmytro, a sushi lunch with Japan's envoy, a clear, deliberate public gesture here. What exactly is Taiwan signaling to both Beijing and Japan with this move?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that Taiwan sees Japan as the first ally who actually gonna help them in case of any conflict, and actually situation with Chinese-Japanese relations and the friction in relations gives Taipei a chance to become closer to Japan, actually. Pretty good chance, actually.
Yes, and of course, China now says that trade cooperation with Japan has been severely hit, with China also floating the banning of Japanese seafood imports over to Beijing. Is Beijing using the same economic coercion playbook as, for example, in South Korea in 2017?
Yes, especially China will use all the tools to press Japan. So banning the seafood is one of the tools, and we can see that, well, Chinese also proclaim that they don't want Chinese citizens go to Japan for traveling. So it's another tool of influence which can be also very pricey for Japan. And even as the Chinese airlines, they claim that they will cancel the flights for Chinese who already booked the flights without any fees, additional fees, and return the money.
Yes, and Dimitro, of course, it has been just a few weeks since the APEC summit where we saw the new Japanese Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, shake hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping. A lot has obviously happened since then, with these tensions seem to be escalating on a daily basis. How do you see this situation playing out?
Well, at the same time, the Japanese Prime Minister also met with Taiwanese representative in ASEAN forum. So it's also a very important sign that Japan isn't interested in stable Taiwan. So I suppose these frictions will be over like within 3-4 weeks, but because nobody interested in sharpening the situation at the moment. However, I think escalation might continue even longer.
Okay, Dimitro, do stay with us as we have further updates from, of course, this developing situation. And ties between Japan and China have deteriorated further after recent comments by Japan's new Prime Minister on a potential security threat from ongoing China-Taiwan conflicts. China has said that its trade cooperation with Japan has suffered a significant setback since those remarks were made. According to the Chinese Commerce Ministry, Japan's position has damaged their bilateral engagement, further adding that Beijing could take extra measures if Tokyo continues to maintain the same stance. In the past week, China has said that Japan's seafood import procedures were insufficient, signaling that a full ban could be implemented within months. Beijing has also halted talks on resuming Japanese beef imports and threatened further action unless Tokyo reversed its position. The issue of Taiwan remains a central point of contention as China maintains its claim over the island, while Japan continues to monitor regional security developments very closely. Dimitro joins us once again. Dimitro, of course, partners in East Asia now seeming to deteriorate. Tensions between the two countries historically troubling. However, now it seems that things are deteriorating to a very bad level when it comes to trade. Can, of course, who will suffer more greatly here, China or Japan, when it comes to the prohibition of exports to both countries if it is to continue?
I suppose Japan is in a more vulnerable position in this case because of the size of economics and actually specific branches of industries which are export related for Japan and ties with China. And actually, it's not the first time this the friction happened in relations between China and Japan, but it seems like the frictions right now are the most severe within the last decade.
Okay, Dimitro Burstev, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. We now move over to West Asia for our next story, and Israel has launched new airstrikes on Gaza early this morning as both sides accused each other of violating the ceasefire that came into effect on October the 10th. Gaza's Civil Defense Agency says 3 people were killed and 15 others were injured after a residential building was hit in the Bani Shwela area of eastern Khan Yunis at around 4 a.m. local time. Authorities say the strikes stopped after 5 a.m, but reports of ongoing artillery fire continue from the Khan Yunis region. The Israeli military is yet to comment on the strikes, however. Humanitarian agencies are closely monitoring developments as civilians in the area continue to face severe risk. Joining us now here on the programme is Sander van Hoorn, a former EU correspondent, and he joins us live from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World, Sander. Pleasure to have you. Israel says that 3 people have been killed in these new recent strikes. This, of course, follows over 20 killed yesterday. What's triggering this violence, and what effects does it have on this already fragile ceasefire in place in the Gaza enclave?
It all started, according to Israel, when 3 of its troops were attacked allegedly by Hamas. Hamas denies they attacked Israeli troops, but that sparked this current flare-up of violence. And most recent figures provided by the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza point to over 30 people killed so far. And Hamas is blaming Israel for violating the ceasefire. Now, the second part of your question, the fragility of this ceasefire, it holds as long as both parties still say it holds and don't say it doesn't. So for now, both parties say they will stick to the ceasefire. We've seen flare-ups in the past, but every flare-up, of course, carries the risk of a major escalation that will not be brought to an end swiftly.
Yeah, and obviously, Sander, there are talks of now what is going to be included in this second phase, an international stabilization force, among other terms. But of course, the sticking point here is the disarmament of Hamas. If this violence does continue, of course, from both sides, allegedly, what are your hopes for the future of this second phase being implemented?
Well, the upside is that the Americans are still involved. That is what got this whole process moving, and their continued involvement is necessary to basically keep both parties, Hamas as well as Israel, to stick to the Trump 20-point plan. And according to this plan, yes, Hamas will be disarmed, but Israel has to withdraw further to the Israeli border of Gaza, something that has not happened yet as well. So both sides will have to take steps, but you see the international community preparing for this phase 2. So yes, there will be an international stabilization force, but who will take part? Will it be Azerbaijan? Will it be Indonesia? Will they be able and willing to confront Hamas in the process of disarmament? And there's even thoughts that go even further ahead. For example, the European ministers of foreign affairs today are discussing training a police force for Gaza. Well, that is like a dot on the horizon, but the first step, of course, is to make people on the ground, the Israelis and the Hamas fighters, understand that they will have to stop fighting in order to proceed with phase 2.
Yes, Sander, do stay with us as we move over from West Asia into Eastern Europe. And of course, a senior Pentagon official led by US Army Secretary Stan Briscoe have arrived in Kiev to discuss efforts to end the war with Russia. Their visit follows reports of a new US-Russia framework peace plan allegedly drafted by Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Russia's Kirill Dmitriev, which could require major concessions from Ukraine, including giving up remaining territory in the Donbass and reducing its military. Neither Washington nor Moscow has confirmed the plan, however, but US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said a durable peace will require difficult but necessary concessions. European leaders, including Kaja Kallas and Joan Noel Barrot, warned that any plan must have Ukrainian support and cannot involve capitulation. The report surfaced the same day as a Russian attack on Ternopil killed at least 26 people. Ukrainian officials say Zelensky and Trump have already agreed to stop the conflict along the current front lines and discuss security guarantees. Driscoll's delegation is the most senior US military team to visit Kiev under Trump, focusing on battlefield conditions and possible ceasefire plans. Meanwhile, details of the 28-point Witkoff-Dmitriev plan continue to circulate, though Ukraine maintains it will not cede territory and Russia says its original demands remain unchanged. Joining us once again is Sander van Hoorn to discuss this ongoing situation in Russia and Ukraine. Sander, this is the most senior US delegation to visit Kiev under the second Trump administration. Before we get into the aspects of this new peace plan by Dmitriev and Witkoff, what message is Washington trying to send by dispatching this delegation to Kiev right now?
They want this war to be over. They want another peace deal that Trump can claim he made possible. And the pressure is now on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is under heavy fire already internally because of corruption scandals. And now he's facing a deal that he, from his perspective, cannot possibly agree on.
Yeah, and Sander, of course, with Ukraine reportedly losing territory on the battlefield, both in Donetsk and other regions. This 28-point plan reportedly calls for Ukraine to give up the remaining Donbass and scale down some of its military, while Ukraine will receive security guarantees from the Trump administration. Of course, Zelensky has reiterated time and time again its territorial integrity will remain as it is. Do you think this 28-point plan, if the reports do turn out to be true, could be remotely acceptable to Kiev, given the current circumstances?
Well, if you have to draw lines from past remarks by Zelensky, then it will be in no way acceptable. He does not even want to talk about ceding the Crimea region of Ukraine, which has been held by Russia for a long time. And it would not only mean this 28-point plan as we know it from leaks that have transpired so far. It wouldn't only mean like ceding the parts of the Donbas region that are being held by Russia right now. It would mean ceding all of Donbas, so also the parts that are being held by Ukraine right now. Now, that's not only about ceding territory, it's also about being able to defend what's left of Ukraine, because the most active front lines, but also the most active defensive lines that Ukraine holds are located in the Donbas region. So that's a very worrying point. Now, the other points you talked about, like reducing the size of the Ukrainian army and ceding long-range missiles, that is something that may be discussed by Ukraine. They have stated so in the past, but that will also depend on the guarantees, the security guarantees being provided by the Europeans, but notably, of course, by the Americans. And about that detail of the 28-point plan, nothing has transpired so far. So the extent and the toughness of those American security guarantees, a lot of things will depend on that. But the territorial concessions, I think, for any Ukrainian president at this point will be a no-go.
Okay, so Sander, once again, I do request you stay with us for our last update coming out of the Ukraine conflict. And EU foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels amid reports of growing pressure on Ukraine to consider a secretive draft peace plan that would require major concessions for Kiev. The plan, reportedly developed by a US envoy and a Kremlin advisor, would give Russia sweeping control over Ukraine's military and political structure and is widely seen as a form of capitulation. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said any proposal must be backed by both Ukrainians and Europeans to be viable. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noel Barrot also said peace cannot mean surrender for Kiev and called for a ceasefire along the contact line to begin any serious discussions. Let's in fact listen in to some comments made by the diplomat.
What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear.
Discussions should start with a ceasefire on the contact line that allow for negotiation on the question of territories, on the question of security guarantees. We have said that, the US have said that, President Trump has said that, and Ukrainians are ready for this. The only obstacle to such ordered discussions so far is Vladimir Putin.
I don't know what the involvement of Ukraine has been in this plan, but obviously for us it's important that whatever peace plan is on the table, that Ukraine is behind it. This is up to Ukraine. It's about Ukrainian territory. It's about Ukrainian sovereignty. So without a buy-in of Ukraine, you won't get the support of the Europeans.
Sander van Hoorn joins us once again. Do you think both the Russians and the Americans are looking at Europe to make any decisions here? Kaja Kallas, of course, says that the plan needs support from Europeans. Does this mean the EU is preparing to openly resit any US-Russia framework imposed from the outside of these discussions?
Well, the problem for the Europeans right now, the foreign ministers meeting in Brussels as we speak, is that they are not privy to the details of the plan. They have not been part of the negotiations about this plan, and that is a big frustration. So will they, just as Ukraine, be left second-guessing what the Americans and the Russians agree upon, and will they be left to pay the bill in the end? That is the questions that will be raised in Brussels today. And can Ukraine actually resist the Americans if they don't agree with the plan? Because the problem is that Ukraine is getting the most of the money from the Europeans, but most of the weapons that are being delivered, and sometimes they are paid for by the Europeans, those are American weapons. So there's only a certain extent that you can say no to the Americans. But the Europeans, and you could hear it in the quotes that you just aired, the Europeans are increasingly worried and frustrated about the way these talks between Russia and America are going.
Sander van Hoorn, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have had your insight here on the programme. We now move on, and at least 26 people have been killed, including 3 children, in a Russian missile strike and drone attack in the western city of Ternopil in Ukraine. The strikes reportedly hit 2 blocks of flats in the western city of Ternopil. Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that 22 people remain missing at the site of the Russian attack in the Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's Air Force said that it had shot down 442 out of 476 drones and 41 out of 48 missiles launched by Russia during the strikes. Energy facilities, transport and civil infrastructure were also damaged elsewhere in western Ukraine. Electrical supplies are already being rationed, and after the latest attacks, the Energy Ministry announced more power cuts across the country. We, of course, will keep you updated on everything coming out of the conflict as soon as we get it here on NewsX World. Now we move over for our final story to South Asia, and as the air quality index in Delhi continues to hover at hazardous levels, residents called for the government to take more action to mitigate the city's crippling pollution crisis. The city's air quality index was recorded at 399, ranked as very poor as per SAFAR, a weather forecasting agency. Delhi and surrounding districts are often covered in smog during winter, as cold, dense air traps emissions from vehicles, construction sites and crop burning pushes pollution levels to among the highest in the world. The Delhi government has imposed a ban on non-essential construction work, among other measures, to deal with the rising pollution levels. Meanwhile, here is what some residents of New Delhi had to say about the state of pollution in the capital.
सर ये पोल्यूशन अब से थोड़ी 10 साल से 15 साल से चल रहा है। इसका कोई स्थायी इलाज नहीं है जब तक सरकार इसके ऊपर गंभीर रूप से काम नहीं करेगी। आप सोच रहे हो गाड़ियां बंद करा दो, ईवन रोड करा दो, इससे कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ने वाला। टारगेट रखो कि साल के कम से 2 करोड़ पेड़ दिल्ली में लगाने हैं, ये टारगेट रख के चलो आप। आप सोचोगे आज गाड़ी बंद करा दूँ, कल बिल्डिंग बंद करा दूँ, सरकारी बिल्डिंगों के काम चल रहे हैं, प्राइवेट बंद कर देते हो, इससे कहाँ पोल्यूशन रुकेगा? और कोई सरकार गंभीर नहीं है, पराली हज़ारों सालों से चल रही है, तब दिल्ली में पोल्यूशन नहीं आता। एक ही महीने सोचते पोल्यूशन है, पूरे साल की ये हालत है दिल्ली में।
सर जी, ये प्रदूषण कम होना चाहिए। अब देखो, इस प्रदूषण के चक्कर में मेरी वाइफ इतना बीमार हो रही है, कुछ करूँ, उसके चक्कर में सुबह सुबह आना पड़ रहा है मेरे को। हालांकि सरकार कहती है कि सुबह सुबह बताओ पार्क, मगर क्या करें, मजबूरी है, उसको कम करना चाहिए प्रदूषण।
Now that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international updates.
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights, to ensure that humanitarian law is respected.
UN Security Council needs a makeover, a comprehensive reform, and India deserves a position there, a role there.
Prime Minister Modi during Operation Sindoor made it amply clear that war has never been India's choice. We are with the side of peace. We are neither neutral nor indifferent. We are with peace.
We would have dealt with US a whole lot on trade and those kinds of things, and that's not as certain these days. So we have to go back and look at our European partners, our Asian partners.
An opportunity to exchange, to have a dialogue, to have a debate on a different perspective on finding the solution of the conflict.
First thing that is important to have a common ground, and that we do have with humanitarian laws and human rights, but also to say, okay, what does it mean for us as a country to act on these laws and how can we work together?
When we realize that there's something wrong with democracy, the institutions and policies, values come together and we take stock, and it's possible then to improve and chart a new course for democracy.
It's the people's right to self-determination, and if they want to be independent, they should be independent. We will not start a war against Greenland.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights, to ensure that humanitarian law is respected.
UN Security Council needs a makeover, a comprehensive reform, and India deserves a position there, a role there.
Prime Minister Modi during Operation Sindoor made it amply clear that war has never been India's choice. We are with the side of peace. We are neither neutral nor indifferent. We are with peace.
We would have dealt with US a whole lot on trade and those kinds of things, and that's not as certain these days. So we have to go back and look at our European partners, our Asian partners.
An opportunity to exchange, to have a dialogue, to have a debate on a different perspective on finding the solution of the conflict.
First thing that is important to have a common ground, and that we do have with humanitarian laws and human rights, but also to say, okay, what does it mean for us as a country to act on these laws and how can we work together?
When we realize that there's something wrong with democracy, the institutions and policies, values come together and we take stock, and it's possible then to improve and chart a new course for democracy.
It's the people's right to self-determination, and if they want to be independent, they should be independent. We will not start a war against Greenland.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
Hello and welcome. I'm Vaishali Kohli and you're watching World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines this hour. The White House says a US-backed peace plan promoted by President Donald Trump is good for both Russia and Ukraine. Rejecting concerns it mirrors Moscow's demands, President Zelensky insists any deal must ensure a dignified peace as he meets senior US Army officials in Kyiv. A Russian strike on Zaporizhia killed at least 5 people and injured 3 more. Governor Ivan Fedorov said guided bombs hit the city as emergency crews rescued civilians. Meanwhile, Putin visited a frontline command post amid unverified Russian claims of taking Kupiansk. A senior U.S. official says Chinese and Indian banks and refineries are adjusting practices to comply with sanctions on Russian oil and financial flows. Washington says the shift shows tighter enforcement and is changing behavior across Asia. Russia says it has held in-depth talks with China and Moscow on missile defense and strategic stability, agreeing to boost cooperation. The meetings come amid shared concerns over President Trump's planned Golden Dome missile shield and his intent to resume nuclear testing. U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order removing tariffs on Brazilian imports, including aircraft parts, beef, coffee, and orange juice. The move is welcomed by President Lula and aims to ease trade pressures, support supply chains, and boost economic ties between the U.S. and Brazil. The European Union says it will unveil a new economic security doctrine next month as it prepares a tough trade stance towards China. The shift comes as Germany rethinks its approach, with Brussels reviewing its defense tools amid concerns over rare earths and global geopolitical pressure. China and Kyrgyzstan hold their first ever strategic dialogue focused on security, trade, and regional connectivity. Both sides say they aim to deepen cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative. President Maduro says Venezuela is ready to export gas to Colombia for the first time, as the two countries recently agreed on a binational economic zone to boost trade and energy, with final technical details still being worked out. In the major news from Bangladesh, where an earthquake of magnitude 5.2 shook Bangladesh and West Bengal, several netizens are claiming it was one of the strongest earthquakes they felt. The German Research Center for Geosciences reports the quake occurred at a shallow depth of 10 kilometers, or about 6 miles. Officials are assessing the impact and checking for potential damage and casualties. White House press secretary has said that a U.S. peace plan backed by U.S. President Donald Trump that is being negotiated with Russia and Ukraine is good for both sides, dismissing concerns that it echoes many of Moscow's demands. Listen in.
As always, I'm not going to litigate the details of this plan as it's ongoing and it's in flux, but the president supports this plan. It's a good plan for both Russia and Ukraine, and we believe that it should be acceptable to both sides, and we're working very hard to get it done.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has stated that any deal to end Russia's invasion must bring a dignified peace. This comes as Zelensky has met with senior U.S. Army officials in Kyiv, including U.S. Secretary of the Army Daniel Driscoll. Let's in fact listen in to what Zelensky said.
Ми з перших днів війни займаємо одну надзвичайно просту позицію. Україні потрібен мир. І справжній мир такий, який не зламає третє вторгнення. Достойний мир, щоб умови були з повагою до нашої незалежності, нашого суверенітету, до гідності українського народу. І ми саме такі умови маємо забезпечити.
Meanwhile, Kyiv has stated that it is ready to work constructively with the United States on the proposed plan and that a call between Trump and Zelensky is expected soon. The president's office in Ukraine has also added that it has already received a draft plan from the American side, though it has not revealed the details of the plan. All right, and now I have my guest, Professor Veselin Popovsky, Professor and Vice Dean in the Global Law School, joining me from New Delhi. Now, Professor, of course, my first question to you is, how do you see this conversation between Zelensky and Trump?
I see it positively, as President Zelensky said. Negotiations are important to clarify positions, to look at options, to declare what dignified outcome is very interesting here. But I also assume that what Zelensky means is in respect to international law, territorial sovereignty, political independence. And for that matter, we still need to see those 28 points, but obviously Ukrainians and European Union should be on the table discussing each of those 28 points. There was some leaks in Financial Times and Reuters suggesting that there still could be some territory of Ukraine being conceded. We need to see again that. I assume a possible ceasefire as it stands at the moment, the front line, the battlefield, if that is freezing, if Russia and Ukraine accept to stop the fire, simply as currently the line is, it's acceptable for both sides. Russians don't want to lose any more oil refineries and airports and airplanes. Those Ukrainian hits on Russian targets deep into the Russian territory are obviously reducing Russian military might, and they are very worried about that. And certainly Ukrainians don't like to see every morning some Russian drones and missiles hitting Ukrainian cities and civilian people dead. So on that one, they would agree. They should have agreed 9-10 months ago when Trump first proposed a ceasefire, and Putin, not Ukraine, but Russia, repeatedly rejected all the ceasefire proposals by Donald Trump, supported by Ukraine, for temporary 30-day ceasefire. How many times? 6, 7, 8 times we had those proposals in the past, repeatedly rejected by Moscow. And for me, that's a good news. If Russia finally accepts a ceasefire, it does mean that Russians suffer, their military suffer. Those hits deep into the Russian territory produce finally some acceptance by Moscow to cease the fire. Now, how the long-term peace deal will evolve, we still don't know. It will take some time, but the normal process here is to have a ceasefire, as at the current army should, maybe the current army stay there, but they stop firing at each other. And that could be a good first step, in my opinion.
Professor Popovsky, I'd request you to stay on with me. Now, a Russian strike on the southern eastern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia has left at least 5 people dead and 3 others injured. Regional Governor Ivan Fedorov says the attack came shortly after he warned residents about incoming guided bombs. Emergency crews rushed into battle fires and pulled wounded civilians to safety. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has visited a frontline army command post, receiving updates from top commanders on the war in Ukraine. During the briefing, the commander of Russia's Western Group of Forces, Sergei Kuzylov, claimed that Russian troops have completed the liberation of the eastern Ukrainian city of Kupiansk, a claim that Ukraine has not confirmed. The visit comes as Moscow continues to highlight battlefield gains while the conflict grinds on. And I have Professor Popovsky back with me. Now, Professor, how do you see this conflict progressing?
Well, as we spoke earlier, we hope the conflict will be frozen with the peace plan, but it still needs to be seen. And somehow those hits that Russia does on Ukrainian city continues. Before Zaporozhye, we had another horrible tragedy in Thermopylae with 26 people casualties, civilian casualties there, 3 of them children. So in other words, it's kind of a peculiar that on one hand Russians are talking about peace deal with Donald Trump, but on another hand every day they continue killing civilians and they do nothing else. Russian army doesn't advance. I think the story about Kupiansk or Pokrovsk are absolutely not verified. Very soon after that, we've seen that these cities, which Russia claimed for 7, 8 times they are still not in the Russian hands. So the Russian propaganda works that way. They repeatedly say that they capture some village here and some village there, but days later it becomes obvious that they may have captured, but they lost it 2 or 3 days later. So it doesn't mean anything again in terms of military advantage at all. And for that matter, my argument here earlier expressed is that because Russia cannot do anything on the battlefield, they are stuck. They don't move. They couldn't do what 12 months, 14 months. They announced that project to capture Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, and they did nothing for 14 months in terms of military advance. Now they are trying to get those small pieces of destroyed cities by negotiations, and maybe this is, in my guess, what that plan by Vitkov and Dmitriev is about, that Ukraine may concede Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, which Russians couldn't take with military advance for the last 14 months. And that's, again, I'm a little bit optimistic when I hear that there are negotiations, because at some point they could be a ceasefire, freezing the battlefield, not killing any more civilians. And Ukraine also should stop their missiles and drones reaching deep into the Russian territory. And somehow to get over the winter and sometime in the spring to renew efforts for long-term negotiations. And here will come the other issues potentially in that plan, 28 points, like military weapons, sanctions, territory, and everything else. So it looks like a temporary ceasefire for the winter. If that happens, it's good for both sides. I repeat that. Ukrainians don't want to lose more civilians. Russians are very scared of losing more oil and gas ports and ships and airplanes and everything that almost weekly we see Ukrainians successfully hit, and then come back to the negotiation table after that temporary ceasefire, and then in that negotiation go through all other points in the plan that Trump is suggesting. We still need to see those points, but yes, that's how I, at the moment, evaluate that.
I'd like to thank you, Professor Popovsky, for joining me on the broadcast. And now at a United Nations Security Council meeting, Russia has defended its assault on Ukraine, while the United States and Ukraine have pressed for an immediate ceasefire and a viable path to peace. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia has accused President Vladimir Zelensky of enforcing violent mobilization, forbidding retreats, and seeking a ceasefire only to make sure that their defeated forces get a long-awaited breather. Meanwhile, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz has urged all sides to halt the fighting, adding that diplomacy is the only path to achieve peace in the region. He said that Washington has offered Russia generous terms, including sanctions relief, but has warned that civilian casualties continue to mount as Russia presses its attacks. Listen in.
It is imperative to end this war and begin the process of rebuilding. Colleagues, diplomacy is the only path to a durable and just peace. The United States has invested at the highest levels, the President of the United States personally, to end this war. We have proposed generous terms for Russia, including sanctions relief. We have asked Russia to halt its attacks and meet directly with Ukraine to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Unfortunately, the fighting continues, tragically causing more civilian casualties.
Now, Ukraine's Deputy UN Ambassador Krygystina Havayshine has highlighted recent Russian attacks on Ukrainian regions. She has also reiterated Ukraine's stance on the war, stating that the only path to ending it is compelling Russia to retreat completely. Let's listen in.
There will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as Russian. Our land is not for sale. Ukraine will not accept any limits on its right to self-defense or on the size and capabilities of our armed forces. Nor will we tolerate any infringement on our sovereignty, including our sovereign right to choose the alliances we want to join. There is only one realistic path to ending this war. Russia must be compelled to retreat, economically, politically, and militarily.
Now, the White House has announced a major shift in U.S. trade policy towards Brazil. President Donald Trump has signed an order lifting several sharp tariffs on Brazilian imports, a move which is warmly welcomed by President Lula. The order removes the 40% tariffs previously placed on Brazilian aircraft parts, and it also exempts key agricultural and consumer goods, including beef, coffee, and orange juice. Washington also says that the changes are intended to ease trade pressures and support supply chains across both economies. For Brazil, the tariff removal offers a significant economic boost, especially for its agricultural and aviation sectors. And for the U.S., it marks a recalibration of a trade relationship that has seen tensions rise and fall over the past few years. I have my guest Ross Feingold, political analyst, joining me from Taipei, Taiwan. Now, to begin with, Ross, how do you see White House announcing a major shift in U.S. trade policy towards Brazil?
I'm not sure if it's a major shift. Certainly, the White House has been under pressure over the cost of living, or is the word that people like to use now, affordability issues, or some call it a crisis. Lowering the tariffs on some popular food products will certainly make for good politics for the White House, and people will hopefully be able to buy these goods at a lower pricing point in the coming days and weeks. But the general approach of the Trump administration, as far as using tariffs as a tool to extract trade concessions from trading partners, that is clearly not going to change. President Trump's view on this is well known, and frankly, he views it as successful because of the trade agreements that have been signed with a large number of U.S. trading partners. Some of those agreements include significant investments in the United States, such as by the EU, Japan, and South Korea. So the general policy framework, that's not going to change, even if there are periodic adjustments like we're seeing now with Brazil.
All right, Ross, I'll request you to stay on with me. Now, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejects calls for violence during a traditional military parade held in Zocalo, just a few kilometers away from a demonstration organized by Generation Z to protest against her security policy. This comes as the Mexican police blocked the protesters gathered on Paseo de la Reforma from heading towards Mexico City's Zocalo, where the parade was organized. Let's listen to what the president had to say.
Para unos cuantos, el que convoca a la violencia se equivoca. El que alienta al odio se equivoca. El que cree que la fuerza sustituye a la justicia se equivoca. El que convoca una intervención extranjera se equivoca. El que convoca, saben que no nos vamos a someter a los intereses de quienes antes ostentaban el poder o gozaban de privilegios, ni a ningún gobierno o interés extranjero. Saben que no seremos figuras decorativas.
Now, protesters are marching in Mexico City against President Claudia Sheinbaum's government, demanding action on insecurity, corruption, and improvements in education, healthcare, and wages.
Uno, para exigir justicia, y dos, que escuchen a los jóvenes. Porque más que nada, yo soy de Zacatecas y te puedo decir que los jóvenes se están acercando más y más al crimen organizado. Yo tuve que irme de Zacatecas a la ciudad, o sea, desde ese punto de vista.
Bueno, yo vengo a la marcha porque la verdad vivimos en una inseguridad que ya es insoportable. Todas las personas que nos venimos a manifestar o que venimos a esta marcha, venimos por un motivo, porque ya no se puede vivir con seguridad parada. Ahora se tiene que dar cuenta el gobierno que no estamos con ningún partido, que nosotros estamos viniendo por nuestros problemas, por nuestra voluntad, por lo que estamos sufriendo. No estamos...
La generación de los jóvenes, que estamos hartos de este gobierno de Morena, pero ya no solamente es la Gen Z, sino son generaciones de adultos mayores, niños, de varias personas que nos unimos por un mismo propósito, salvar a México de este narcogobierno.
I have my guest joining me back on the broadcast, Ross Feingold, political analyst from Taipei, Taiwan. Now, Ross, I want to begin by asking you, how do you see Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejecting calls for violence during a traditional military parade held in Zocalo? We've also played out her statement for our viewers.
Clearly, she has a significant domestic political challenge with a public safety crisis. This is not a new issue for Mexico. It's a long-time issue. The power of drug cartels in parts of the country is significant. There's often violence between competing organizations, violence between drug organizations and the security forces. There's a long-time problem with kidnappings, including kidnappings that remain and disappearances that remain unsolved. But her job as president is to solve that issue, but also call on people not to engage in any more violence. Interesting thing is, you have to keep in mind, she was elected with 61% of the vote, which in any democratic election is huge success. So she had high popularity in the election a little over 2 years ago. And her popularity has remained higher. Popularity has typically polled, or her approval rating, even higher than the 61% of the vote that she received. So it seems that most Mexicans are very happy with her leadership, and she's continuing to do or make public policy decisions that she feels is the right thing to do or say, and the public is behind her.
And Ross, Gen Z is also not happy with her security policy, and they're protesting against it. What would you like to say on that?
Well, it's certainly easy to get Gen Zs mobilized. We're talking about a generation that uses social media, obviously. So it's easy to mobilize people and come out and protest. But again, I think there might be a bit of a disconnect here, because the polls consistently show that the public is happy with her performance as president. So we have to be careful about over-interpreting a relatively small number of protesters. But there are significant issues that President Sheinbaum faces, and if she doesn't deal with them in a way that the public is satisfied, then she will face significant challenges going forward. So this includes the public safety issues. Mexico, like other places, has an affordability crisis, and also trade disputes with the United States, going into a period over the next coming months where the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are going to be renegotiating their trade agreement, the free trade agreement. So she certainly has a lot of challenges, notwithstanding the popularity that she's enjoyed over her first 2 years in office.
Thank you, Ross, for joining me on the broadcast. And now, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says that Venezuela is ready to export gas to Colombia for the first time. In mid-June, both Venezuela and Colombia have agreed to create a binational economic zone to boost the production and trade, with an emphasis on energy, as the natural gas is already at the border and ready to be delivered to Colombia. Maduro also says that a few technical and economic details are still being finalized before gas exports begin. He also added that the people of Venezuela and Colombia are united and increasingly integrated, with more prosperous economy and growing trade as the binational investments grow. Meanwhile, Venezuela's National Assembly has approved a 15-year extension of the joint ventures between state company PDVSA and a unit of Russia's Rosabeth Neft that has operated 2 oil fields in Venezuela's western region. The partnerships may continue operating the Boquerón and Perilla oil fields through 2041, with the goal of producing some 91 million barrels, or 16,600 barrels per day of crude, as the total investment is estimated about $616 million. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
Hello and welcome. I'm Suma Katauka and you're watching World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. Senior Pentagon officials led by Army Secretary Dan Driscoll arrived in Kyiv to meet President Zelensky and discuss efforts to end the war with Russia. This visit comes as reports emerge of a new peace plan and after a Russian strike killed at least 26 people in Ternopil. The Kremlin has said that there are no formal peace talks with the United States on Ukraine, adding it has nothing new to say about a reported 28-point plan. Moscow insists any settlement must address what it calls the root causes of the war and criticizes European nuclear rhetoric, while noting Putin does not use AI himself. President Donald Trump says he has signed a bill requiring the release of government documents on Jeffrey Epstein. Trump, who had earlier opposed the measure, announces on Truth Social that he has just signed the bill. Hamas has condemned new Israeli airstrikes in Gaza as a dangerous escalation, warning they threaten an already fragile ceasefire. Israel says the strikes respond to a Hamas violation, while medics report at least 25 people killed in the latest attacks. The Israeli military says Hezbollah is violating a ceasefire by rebuilding operations in southern Lebanon. Near the Israeli border, it says dozens of sites, including headquarters and weapons stores in civilian homes, have been identified around the village of Beit Lif. A Philippine court sentences former Mayor Alice Guo to life imprisonment after finding her guilty of human trafficking. Authorities say Guo, later identifies as Chinese national Guo Huaping, ran for office under a false Filipino identity. Sudan's army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan says he is ready to work with the United States and Saudi Arabia on efforts to end the conflict. His council thanks regional mediators and says it will seriously engage in pursuit of lasting peace. Gunmen stormed a church in Kwara State, killing 2 people and kidnapping the pastor and several worshippers, as police say. The attack comes days after a massive abduction of schoolgirls and amid growing pressure on Nigeria from President Trump over Christian persecution. Now we start with the Middle East. Qatar, one of the central mediators in the Hamas-Israel war, is condemning a new wave of Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, warning they could destabilize the fragile truce that has held for several weeks. In a statement, Qatar's foreign ministry has called the strikes brutal attacks and a dangerous escalation, saying they threaten to undermine the ceasefire agreement that Doha has been working to sustain. The condemnation comes after a Gaza hospital reported 4 people killed in fresh strikes earlier today. This follows that what officials say was one of the deadliest days since the truce began on October 10th, with Gaza's Civil Defense Agency reporting 27 deaths on Wednesday alone. Israel and Hamas continue to accuse each other of violating the ceasefire, with Israel insisting its strikes are targeting Hamas positions, while Gaza's health ministry says more than 312 Palestinians have been killed during the truce period. Now for this discussion, we welcome Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us again. Good to see you. Mark, what do you think, what are the challenges that mediators like Qatar are facing when a truce appears to be faltering so often? How much influence can external actors realistically exert on the behavior of Israel and Hamas right now?
Asuma, good to be with you again. Well, let's just put the cards on the table. One of the things that Qatar can stop doing is to actually oversee the funding of Hamas, as the leadership were there of Hamas for a number of years, living high on the hog in some very expensive hotels, before people turn around and go, "Oh, you're making that up." Well, people go and do the research and the history of that. They played it both sides. You have used a very interesting term when you've said like a ceasefire. Yes, this is a ceasefire. What happens is part of this 20 plan, part of the we've just seen the UN resolution, but the 20-point plan that the Trump administration has put forward is to then see that Hamas will be they will give up all their guns and they will be completely disarmed, and that another group will then another group of nations will then oversee that, and then the governance of Gaza. They have not given up their weapons whatsoever, and true to form, in my humble opinion, they have no intention of doing so. Also, with what is happening with this whole discussion of the yellow line, is that they are pushing back all the time. It's what then the IDF are then finding, whether it's finding rocket launchers, other ammunitions, other military hardware within right up to that yellow line that has been demarcated there, and they are then going to take those out. Hamas need to disarm. That is what is number one there. And Qatar, as I've said, without sounding repetitive, they have spoken out of both sides of their mouth in the regard that, oh yes, we can moderate, we want a peace deal, but at the same time being funded this, as they have funded many things around the world in regard to into universities, and then pushing all the marches that have then happened over the last 2 years in regard to the rhetoric that we have seen in capital cities all over the world. Asuma.
Yes, and Mark, what do you think? As you rightfully mentioned, that demilitarization of Hamas, it looks like it's not even close to demilitarization of Hamas. Why do you think the peace or the peace talks of or pursuing the second phase continues while the demilitarization hasn't happened? Why do you think that some actors mediating have given up on demilitarizing Hamas?
You ask a very, very important question, and the other important question to ask everyone or to lay out on the table, it's how we view people. We view a Middle Eastern mindset from a Western point of view, and we then put that within our values and think, oh, if you negotiate, people are going, oh yes, we will do this, but within the Middle East, but they won't. It comes down to strength, and Hamas, as you and I just agree, have no intention, in my humble opinion, of then putting down their weapons. With then Israel has got huge issues again, and I stood on both borders recently in regard to the south and the north. But if you then go to Lebanon, and the Hezbollah are then rearming, there are huge issues again. So people may say one thing, and then their actions will do another, and the only thing that they will respond to is strength, and that is what Israel is then showing. We've asked you to do this, you're not, so we will then take actions against you, and that is down in Gaza, and that will also be with Hezbollah as well. And all of this just has to be honestly said, and has to be unpacked constantly as a reminder. And this sadly is where we're at. At the end of the day, you only have to read the Hamas charter, and then within the charter it talks about the complete annihilation of Israel, which is the Jewish homeland. That is where we're at. Asuma.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. Hamas is accusing Israel of violating the current ceasefire by pushing military positions beyond what is known as the Yellow Line, the agreed boundary behind which Israeli forces were required to pull back. Speaking today, Hamas's spokesperson Hazem Qasim has said that Israeli troops are working daily to shift that line westwards, calling it a clear breach of both the ceasefire and the maps included in President Trump's published plan. Qasim has urged international mediators to intervene immediately, saying Israel's actions show blatant disregard for the diplomatic efforts underway. has added that the yellow line must be restored to its original position if the ceasefire is to hold. Now we welcome back Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Mark, for staying with us. Now, we were just discussing how what's the situation is looking like over there. How does this conflicting claims of continuous ceasefire violations by both Israel and Hamas, how do you think this is shaping international responses now?
Well, of course, it's shaping that, but it all depends. What your particular views are. The thing is, within regard to Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, they are not friends with Israel one iota, and let's just be honest about that and put that on the table. The IDF has been into Gaza, the most horrific urban warfare that you would have to fight. They have then had to come against a tunnel system that, if you combine the London Underground and the New York Underground system, you might even just about get to what Hamas have actually built. They've taken all that money that the EU and various other countries around the world, and they have then taken that and then built this tunnel system to then, within their dream, as I just said earlier, is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and get rid of the Jewish homeland. That's it. That is what their mindset is. So when you are dealing with that kind of mindset, the only thing that you can respond to is strength. We go back to the 7th of October 2023, you go back to the 6th of October 2023, there was peace there, you could say, and of course rockets had regularly come over from Gaza, and having visited the Gaza envelope recently, and you walk into a kibbutzim and then you find out that there were 400 people living there, and 200 of those were are dead now or taken hostage. This is the reality on the ground. The Israelis withdrew in 2005 and gave the Palestinians then their own land to then make that into a homeland, make it into a beautiful Mediterranean holiday resort. They chose not to do that. They chose to turn it into a rocket launch pad. All of these things have to be reminded of, and also to remember, just quickly, that Egypt had not facilitated at all anyone moving from Gaza into their country, so they would not suffer of any military action that, of course, Hamas started on the 7th of October. They have not done that. When you pick through all of the history, all of the facts, it comes down to one thing. They do not want to live peacefully at all with Israel. You then have to go through Erdogan of Turkey's rhetoric to then back that up. Unfortunately, people don't like facts and they don't like history, and that is what we then have to talk about. Asuma.
Right. Thank you very much, Mark, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, moving on to Europe, Ukraine is reportedly expected to give up land and some arms under a U.S. peace plan, which also includes cutting the size of Ukraine's armed forces. Now, Washington wants Kyiv to accept the main points of the peace plan to end the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. These peace plan proposals have come in as Ukraine faces aggressive Russian territorial gains in its eastern regions. According to some reports, Ukraine initially received signals about the peace U.S. plan, but did not participate in drafting it. The White House has declined to comment on the matter. In all of this, it is important to note that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has been consistent about his demands, which is that Ukraine must renounce NATO membership. Russia also wants Ukraine to withdraw troops from 4 disputed provinces. Meanwhile, in the latest development, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has held talks with Turkish President Erdogan in Turkey's Ankara. Now, Turkey is ready to provide a platform for continued talks. The Kremlin has assured that President Putin is open to discussions with the U.S. and Turkey. Additionally, U.S. delegation led by Army Secretary Dan Driscoll and General Randy George is currently in Kyiv. They will meet Ukrainian President Zelensky to review the proposals and verify the other factual details on the ground. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Mark, for staying with us. Now, Mark, realistically, how effective could this be, these, again, 28-point peace plan by U.S. For brokering or trying to broker a ceasefire between U.S. and, Russia and Ukraine? How do you think reportedly requiring Ukraine to cede territory, do you think this whole is feasible?
The number one thing is, as you and I have constantly discussed over the last few months on this channel, is to say we want this war to stop. It cannot be denied. February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Behind the scenes, the whole discussion has been about this is how far we have come. This is what we want in regard to taking 20% of the land of Ukraine, which they then have held to this point. We need these people to get round the table and to be serious about that. We know of the appalling losses that the Ukrainians have held, and also in regard to the destruction of towns and villages. The number one thing is we want it to end, and we want it to end now, whether we can bring these people to the table. But of course, understandably, the Russians have said, where their Foreign Minister Lavrov has said, that there has been a peace deal on the table since January, February of 2024. And understandably, the Ukrainians are going, hold on a minute, we have lost a lot of men, but also and women, and the destruction. And we would like some of the land, we would like our territory back. That hence why it's difficult to get these people around the table to agree this. But Asuma, that may be happening. There's all sorts of conversations going on behind the scenes. In regard to NATO, that has always been an interesting discussion, because for some historians we have felt that the agreement of Germany coming together was the agreement which Gorbachev said, yep, let's go ahead with this, as long as you don't expand NATO right up to the Russian borders. Then certain historians would deny that was ever said or was ever put in print. And again, it's going back into history and looking at how we have actually got to this point. Asuma.
Right. Thank you very much, Mark, for sharing that insight. Now we move on to EU. Hungary's Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó has said that the European Union should hold financial support to the Ukrainian government following new corruption reports. He made these statements in Brussels ahead of a meeting with his European Union counterparts. His comments came a day after Ukraine's parliament dismissed two ministers who were caught up in a major corruption investigation. The probe centers on an alleged $100 million scheme involving contracts at the State Nuclear Energy Agency. This case has intensified public outrage over long-standing corruption concerns, including within President Volodymyr Zelensky's inner circle. Szijjártó said the situation in Ukraine does not look promising at this time. His remarks added to the broader debate within the European Union over future support for Kyiv. As they arrived for the same meeting, the Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergaard and Poland's Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski had said any future peace plan for Ukraine must include the European Union. This discussion comes as EU member states continue to assess political, financial, and security implications of the war and the ongoing corruption investigation in Ukraine. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Mark, for staying with us. Mark, now looking at this and Hungary's fresh calls to hold funding, what do you think this is revealing about the fatigue and about the division within the EU for supporting Ukraine further?
Again, in Hungary's case, dear Viktor Orbán, who has a tremendous history in regard to dealing with Russia and dealing with communism, he's also wanting to keep open a relationship with Russia because Hungary relies on getting its energy, buying oil, etc., from Russia. That immediately has to be put on the table. The last thing that anyone wants is fraud. One of the people that have been accused also owns 50% of Zelensky's production company in the past. So that has to be said here as well. Any fraud is wrong, and that is a deep concern from a number of people. And in many ways, you don't know what to believe at times when there is the accusations, as President Zelensky bought a house here, etc. There is so many billions and billions of dollars, pounds, and other money that has gone into the Ukraine. And also it's important that you keep the receipts. We need to know where the money has gone. And in any situation like this, sadly, it ends up falling into the wrong hands. But you know as well as I do that a few weeks ago, Budapest said, look, let's get Russia and Ukraine round the table in our country. And I think that was said in extremely good faith because of the political walk that Viktor Orbán has to then walk with all the countries that surround him, and that is said in all sincerity. And he is also, understandably, like other countries, calling out the fraud, which has to be said. Now, on the other hand, some people are saying that behind the scenes, in regard to Zelensky, there is now a push to oust him and get him out of power. That discussion is also going on. Depending on where you get your news sources from and how you then weigh up the people that come out with that opinion as well. There is a lot of chatter, a lot of info out there that we have to constantly go through to find out what the truth is.
Yes,
Assume.
it's becoming harder and harder to filter the truth. Thank you very much, Mark Sutherland, for joining us today and sharing that insight throughout our news as a geopolitical commentator from London. Now we have a breaking news. The International Atomic Energy Agency has passed a new resolution pressing Iran to immediately provide full access and information about its nuclear program, in line with United Nations Security Council requirements. The measure was introduced by the United States and the E3, which is Britain, France, and Germany, and was adopted by the IAEA Board of Governors with 19 votes in favor, 3 against, and 20 abstentions. The resolution urges Iran to comply fully and without delay with its legal obligations and to grant inspectors the access and documentation they have been requesting for months. Diplomats say the text specifically calls on Iran to update the agency on the status of its enriched uranium stockpile and the condition of nuclear facilities that were bombed in previous attacks. The vote comes amid growing international concerns over Iran's expanding enrichment activity and a widening gap between Tehran and the IAEA. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Yossi Cooper-Wasser. He's an Israeli intelligence and security expert, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Yossi, for joining us again. Good to see you. Yossi, now thank you. Yossi, now looking at Iran and IAEA, do you think Iran will let IAEA access their nuclear facilities again? And how long do you think this will take for the IAEA to be to get access to Iran's nuclear program again?
Well, so far it doesn't seem that the Iranians are willing to allow the IAEA inspectors access to the facilities that were hit by the Israelis and the Americans back in June. And it's clear that the facilities were severely hit, but the main question left open is what happened to the highly enriched uranium, the 60% that the Iranians had plenty of, more than 450 kilograms of such highly enriched uranium. And the Iranians refuse to give any details. I'm not sure that they know themselves, but they don't allow access to the places where they have stocked this quantity, and although it was attacked by Israel and the Americans, it's not clear what happened to them. And the Iranians refused to allow access, and the reaction to this IAEA decision is just very negative, and they denied the request and threatened to take steps against the international community. That's what we have until now.
Right. With that, I would like to thank Yossi Cooper-Wasser for joining us and sharing that insight throughout our news. Thank you very much. Now we move on to our next news. A bipartisan U.S. commission has said that China ran a disinformation campaign to hurt sales of French Rafale fighter jets after India used the planes in May, and the first time against Chinese weapons deployed by its neighbor Pakistan. More than half a dozen countries have bought the Rafale, whose reputation took a hit this year when Pakistan's Chinese-made J-10 fighter shot down at least one Rafale used by India during a 4-day conflict between the neighbors. As per U.S. reports, China used fake social media accounts to share AI-generated images, as well as video games images of supposed debris of aircraft that Chinese weaponry had destroyed. Meanwhile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has slammed the report as false. Now for this discussion, we welcome retired Major General G.T. Dwivedi. He's an international and defense expert, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Major General, for joining us again. Thank you. Good to see you. Major General, what are we to make of this Chinese disinformation campaign targeting this particular Rafale fighter jet? Can you tell us what exactly is this, or how significant is Rafale fighter jet, and what are the broader geopolitical implications of this disinformation being used to influence military balances?
Well, Suma, this report of U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission does not come as a surprise. In fact, it only substantiates what the French intelligence had also reported, that Chinese have tried to tarnish the image and the reputation of the Rafale fighters. Well, just before I give you a very specific answer, having served in China as a defense attaché, I can say with certain amount of conviction that Chinese have a policy of gray zone warfare. In that, the key elements are propaganda, psychological warfare, and of course, misinformation warfare along with legal means. So Chinese have just only pursued the well-known policy in the case of the Rafale. Now coming to this specific case, the Rafale is a reputed, fighter jet of 4.5 generation, and India used it very effectively during Op Sindoor and caused considerable damage both to the terrorist infrastructure and also the Pakistani forces and their air bases. Now, Chinese J-20 fighter is in competition with the other top of the line aircraft. They have J-20, which is a stealth fighter, and J-35, which is export version. So more in question is the J-35 because they were trying to sell this aircraft to a couple of countries, including Indonesia. So they found that Rafale is a competitor, so they resorted to the misinformation campaign and even showed AI-generated images and clips in which they showed that one of the Rafale was shot down by the Chinese PL-15 missile. Now the point is that Chinese are a big arm exporter and they would like to capture as much market as possible. And they always go into such games where they play false narrative, false campaign to project their own equipment. And in fact, the Chinese diplomatic corps also plays a major role. In fact, in number of embassies, the Chinese ambassadors and their diplomatic staff also played this same narrative and trying to project that the Chinese equipment got better of the Western equipment when they were
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union.
Hello and welcome. I'm Vaishali Kohli and you're watching Gulf Today on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines this hour. India and Israel have agreed to enter negotiations for a free trade agreement. India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal highlighted the country's unlimited potential for economic cooperation, while Israel's Economy Minister said the deal will make India a priority for Israeli businesses. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says the U.S. has guaranteed Israel's qualitative military edge after Trump proposed selling 5 F-35 jets to Saudi Arabia. U.S. Secretary Marco Rubio reassured Israel's advanced jets remain protected. The White House says it was unaware of a July meeting between U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee and Jonathan Pollard, who served 30 years in prison for spying for Israel. Pollard said he met Huckabee to thank him for efforts securing his release, a meeting that caught U.S. officials by surprise. The UN called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Israeli troops in southern Syria concerning and urged Israel to honor the 1974 disengagement agreement. Damascus condemned the trip as a violation of sovereignty. The White House says a U.S.-backed peace plan promoted by President Donald Trump is good for both Russia and Ukraine, rejecting concerns it mirrors Moscow's demands. President Zelensky insists any deal must ensure a dignified peace as he meets senior U.S. Army officials in Kyiv. A Russian strike on Zaporizhia killed at least 5 people and injured 3 more. Governor Ivan Fedorov said guided bombs hit the city as emergency crews rescued civilians. Meanwhile, Putin visited a frontline command post amid unverified Russian claims of taking Kupiansk. President Maduro says Venezuela is ready to export gas to Colombia for the first time, as the two countries recently agreed on a binational economic zone to boost trade and energy, with final technical details still being worked out. U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order removing tariffs on Brazilian imports, including aircraft parts, beef, coffee, and orange juice. The move is welcomed by President Lula and aims to ease trade pressures, support supply chains, and boost economic ties between the U.S. and Brazil. India and Israel have signed the terms of reference for negotiations for a free trade agreement as the Indian Ministry of Commerce and Industry Piyush Goyal announced that the two countries have decided to enter into negotiations for FTA. He underlined that the two nations have unlimited possibilities and potential to expand economic engagement. Meanwhile, the Israeli Economy Minister said that India is one of the best friends Israel has around the world and that the free trade agreement will make India a priority for Israeli entrepreneurs. Let's in fact listen in to what the two leaders have said.
The bilateral investment treaty and the free trade agreement will open the doors to greater market access, flow of capital, investments and trade, both in goods and services, remove obstacles to doing business, provide clarity, predictability, and stability to our economic engagement. We work together in the space of defense as much as we work together in agri-tech, fintech, education, space technologies, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, the sky is the limit to the potential between the two countries.
I think everyone in the world saw what we did to Iran. Okay? We've demonstrated that we have deep penetration, excellent intelligence, excellent weaponry for defense, and as important, the best defense is offense. And we only share these ideas with our best friends. And I could certainly tell you that India is one of the best friends Israel has around the world. That the free trade agreement that we're talking about will make India a priority for Israeli entrepreneurs. We call it sort of a hub to Asia. And so I think that's a classic win-win. Many of the companies I spoke to understand that big potential. And we have to make that ecosystem simple. The governments have to make it simple. That's part of the free trade agreement.
I have Peter Baum, editor, Weekly Blitz, joining me on the broadcast from London. Now, Peter, I want to begin by asking you, now, India and Israel have, of course, signed the terms of reference for negotiations for a free trade agreement. How do you see this?
What a wonderful story to end the week. A real good news story, and what a boost for Israel's supporters, and what a kick in the teeth for Israel's enemies. Now, we know that India and Israel have had very good relations for a number of years now. There is no doubt about it. On all my visits to Israel, I've seen many Indian people who are there not only for the tourism, but working in tech, in agriculture, in the health services and in education. And I'm sure India now will become a major tourist spot for all Israelis and for all supporters of Israel's globally. This, as both diplomats have said, is a win-win for both countries. As we know, Israel and India, for their weapons trade agreements, I think India was accountable between 2020 and 2024 for about 35% of all weaponry exported by Israel. This further enhances the trade agreements. It's a great news for both countries. The Indian market is absolutely huge. Israel's technology is amongst the best in the world, and India can thrive from this, as can Israel. So, and more importantly, geopolitically, it sends a message. It sends a message to all those Arab countries, all those Muslim countries who would rather see India harmed and indeed see Israel harmed, that these two democracies will thrive and grow together in all spheres, politically, technology, in agriculture, in water, irrigation, etc., etc. It really is a lovely story to end the week in, and everyone who believes in democracy globally can only be supportive of this tie-up.
Peter, you know, the free trade agreement also mentions that it'll make India a priority specifically for Israeli entrepreneurs. So would you like to shed some light on that?
Yeah, as we know, for various reasons, Israeli entrepreneurs have been responsible for floating and selling some of the most, currently the biggest tech companies globally, on the NASDAQ, etc., etc. Israel intelligence and Israeli technology and entrepreneurship are amongst the highest in the world. It would be hoped that those skill sets will be exported to India. I'm sure they will be exported to India, whereby Indian entrepreneurs, already some of the smartest in the world, will be further encouraged to educate, to develop, to create their own companies that will be floated on the worldwide markets at massive premiums. So I think the tie-up between the two, as the diplomat said, is a win-win situation. It will certainly help the Indian stock market going forward. It would certainly help investment in India from a startup point of view. So by every account, I can't see one negative, but only positives about this story. And as I said before, for all those who believe in democracies globally and who support India and who support Israel, this is really, really exceptional news. Great news. I can't overemphasize how important this is to both countries, and going forward, how profitable and exceptional it will be to both countries.
Peter, I'd request you to stay on with me. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he received guarantees from the United States that Israel's qualitative military edge in the region will remain intact. Netanyahu spoke after a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio following President Donald Trump's announcement of a potential sale of F-35 warplanes to Saudi Arabia. Netanyahu said Rubio reassured him that the U.S. remains committed to preserving Israel's military advantage, including its F-35 capabilities, which are legally guaranteed. Israel is currently the only Middle East country operating F-35 jets, regarded as the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Meanwhile, the Israeli Air Force has opposed selling the jets to Saudi Arabia, warning it could affect Israel's regional air superiority, while Saudi Arabia's jets would be less advanced than Israel's customized F-351 Adir. The deal has sparked concern in Jerusalem. And I, of course, have my guest, Peter Baum, editor, Weekly Blitz, joining me from London. Now, Peter, how do you see this development?
Yes, it's a very strange one. Undoubtedly, the Israeli-Saudi relationship is complex. Historically, they've been enemies, let's face it. But because of the sheer expansionism and military expansionism via Iran, Israel considers Saudi to be my enemy's enemy. Through Trump, that relationship, that dynamic has changed. And Saudi did indeed allow Israel to use its airspace, and has done for a couple of years now, for various missions, certainly when attacking the Houthis in Yemen. So we've got past that stage of my enemy's enemy is my friend, and now both Israel and the Saudis recognize that together they can thwart the bigger threat to the region, which has been Iran and her proxies. Now, clearly, the hawks in the Israeli cabinet would rather that the Saudis were not able to obtain such sophisticated weaponry from Trump. But Trump is a businessman, and he will do what he can to export and to sell American goods to his friends. And he does consider Saudi Arabia to be a friend on the global stage. The hawks in the Israeli cabinet are very upset about this, about selling such sophisticated weaponry, but I think the more pragmatic cabinet members, and indeed Israeli society as a whole, recognize that they have to have friends in the Arab region, and Saudi Arabia, being a major Arab nation, can be part of that achievement. Naturally, they would like them to have signed up to the Abraham Accords, which they're reluctant to do so until the Palestinian state status is more controlled, let's say. It's given more help, given more assistance. But I think Israeli society as a whole, and I think Netanyahu has recognized this, As long as Israel has the technical edge on the weaponry, which Trump has assured the Israelis that it has, they will not be too despondent that they have an associate in the region that will stand up to any Iranian and Shia threat. And Saudi Arabia will now be able to do this. It will not be all up to Israel. So I think if we're looking upon it from a completely impartial point of view, it works for America, it works for Saudi, and it's more than on a scale of 100%, it's 65% works for Israel. So I think the hawks in the Israeli cabinet may put up a fight, they may sound off in the media, etc., etc., but I think Israel and the Israeli cabinet as a whole won't be too concerned about this agreement that the US has with Saudi.
Thank you, Peter, for joining me on the broadcast. And now, well, White House spokeswoman Karoline Leavitt says that the White House was unaware of a meeting between U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee and Jonathan Pollard, the former U.S. Navy analyst who spent 3 decades in prison for spying for Israel. According to media reports, Huckabee met Pollard in July at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. The meeting was kept off Huckabee's official schedule and caught U.S. officials by surprise. Meanwhile, Jonathan Pollard says that he sought the recently revealed meeting with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mark Huckabee, to thank the Trump envoy for its efforts to secure his release from prison. Pollard was convicted in 1987 and sentenced to life, the harshest punishment ever given for spying for an ally, for passing highly classified U.S. material to Israel. He served 30 years before being paroled in 2015 and moving to Israel in 2020. The case stressed U.S.-Israel relations, and many in the U.S. intelligence community still view his case as one of the most damaging breaches of classified information in U.S. history. While some in Israel regard him as a hero, let's listen in to what the White House spokesperson had to say.
The White House was not aware of that meeting, but the President stands by our Ambassador, Mike Huckabee, and all that he's doing for the United States and Israel.
And I now have my guest joining me on the broadcast, Dr. Punsara Amarasinghe, Middle East Affairs expert, Kotalavala Defense University, and he's joining me from Colombo. Now, I'd like to begin by asking you, how do you feel about the White House spokeswoman Karoline Leavitt saying that the White House, of course, was unaware of a meeting between U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee and Jonathan Pollard, the former U.S. Navy analyst?
In my opinion, this would not lead to a severe diplomatic halubalu between Washington and Jerusalem, because the media spokesperson from White House has clearly emphasized the fact that White House was not aware of this unexpected meeting. But then again, I need to tell you that this might kind of, revival of that one of the most, the diplomatic blunders, I would say that one of the most outrageous events in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, which paved the path to deteriorate the relations between CIA and Mossad. As you clearly mentioned, Jonathan Pollard, his legacy has entered history as a convict and as a person who unveiled classified documents from United States to Israel, and he was working as one of the coveted agents for Israeli intelligence community. And as you clearly pointed out, that after serving in prison for nearly 20 years, he was released in year 2015. Now that affair has been ended for good, but still there is a kind of a stir going on in the intelligence community about these issues, especially in particular in the aftermath of the imprisonment of Jonathan Pollard. Most of the intelligence commentators from United States and the West have clearly questioned about the loyalty of the American Jews in Washington or elsewhere in North America. Like, they were questioning whether they are keeping their allegiance to United States or Israel. So this is kind of a issue that comes back, that hits back from the past after this recent meeting between U.S. Ambassador and Jonathan Pollard in Jerusalem, which has been alerted by the CIA chief in Jerusalem as well. But in conclusion, in my conviction, this will not lead to a further or severe diplomatic halubalu between the two countries.
All right, I'd request you to stay on with me. Now, United Nations spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric has called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Syria concerning. He's also urged Israel to agree to the 1974 disengagement agreement. Let's listen in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this very public visit is concerning, to say the least. We call on Israel to respect the disengagement, 1974 disengagement agreement. As you'll recall, in the recently passed resolution 2799, the Security Council called for the full sovereignty, unity, and independence and territorial integrity of Syria. This is also an issue that was raised during the recent meeting between Najat Roshdi and the Foreign Minister of Syria.
Now, this comes as Netanyahu visited Israeli troops deployed in southern Syria, drawing strong condemnation from the government in Damascus, which denounced the trip as a violation of sovereignty. Israel expanded its military presence in southern Syria after the ousting of Bashar al-Assad last December, seizing positions east of a UN-patrolled buffer zone that separates the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from Syrian territory. And I do have Dr. Punsara Amarasinghe, my guest, who's joining me from, of course, Colombo. Now, I want to begin by asking you, of course, now this is a big statement that has been made. How do you feel about it?
Well, ironically, this comes after the meeting between President Shara from Syria with President Trump at White House. At White House, there was a kind of a slight ray of hope that the Syria would do everything to renew ties with Israel. But this recent visit made by Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have shattered all these expectations. And we need to understand this whole trajectory based on the geopolitical escalation, in particular after the fall of Assad regime in 2024 December. If you can clearly recall, since December, Israelis have been intensifying their strikes in South Syria, in southern part of Syria, at unprecedented level. In particular, I think you clearly mentioned about the 1974 disengagement agreement and the UN Security Council resolution. And in terms of those resolution and the agreement, and this seems to be a blatant violation of Syria's own sovereignty. But my question is, has it been concerned by Tel Aviv? Because for past 12 months, for past several months, especially since the fall of Assad's regime in Syria, you can clearly see that Israelis have made a significant incursion into Syrian mainland by occupying a significant position from the Golan Heights. So if this continues, in my opinion, the renewing the ties between two countries, between Damascus and Jerusalem, seems to be highly unlikely.
All right. I'd also like your comments on Israel expanding its military presence in southern Syria after the ousting of Bashar al-Assad last December.
Right. Yeah, I think from Israeli point of view, and they have depicted this as a kind of a temporary defensive position. This is what IDF spokesperson has come up with. Because you know that in Syria, there is a considerable number of Druze, the Druze population. And when Israelis fastened their intensifying military attacks in Syria, they came up with a defense indicating that they need to protect the Druze community stuck in Syrian civil war. And also, Assad regime was kind of a great stalemate or an obstacle for Israelis for more than several decades. But after the fall of Assad's regime, I think Tel Aviv, the Israelis, have considerably leveraged their strategic position towards Syria, in particular in terms of occupying the whole Golan Heights. Right, and which seems to be something really, really crucial in terms of Israeli strategic perspectives.
All right, I appreciate your joining me on the broadcast. Thank you for joining us on NewsX World. And now moving on. Now, European Union Commissioner for the Mediterranean, Dubravka Šuica, says that more international support is needed to stabilize the Palestinian fiscal situation, adding that the bloc recognized the progress made by the Palestinian Authority on key reforms in exceptional circumstances. She also noted that the EU firmly believes that Palestinians must have a real and decisive role in shaping their own future, including governance across the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza. These remarks came during the inaugural meeting of the Palestine Donor Group, a platform bringing together key international partners to support a reformed and well-functioning Palestinian Authority. The group was established as part of the EU's $1.6 billion multi-annual comprehensive program for Palestinian recovery and resilience, and aims to coordinate financial support and monitor the implementation of the Palestinian Authority's reform agenda, with a focus on fiscal stability, governance, and economic recovery in the West Bank and Gaza. Let's listen to what Dubravka Šuica had to say.
Our financial support is linked to the Palestinian Authority reform agenda, which, of course, they committed to implement. We see these reforms as a prerequisite for a viable two-state solution, which is our ultimate goal. As said, our EU support is substantial, but we need further international support to stabilize the Palestinian fiscal situation. Our message was clear. Mr. Prime Minister, you are not alone in this endeavor. We recognize the progress achieved on key reforms under exceptional circumstances. We support your commitment to the reform agenda, in particular on fiscal, economic and governance reforms. The social protection and education reforms remain crucial. More work remains to be done in these areas. It is essential that we remain firmly committed to this path with determination and in full transparency.
Now, at least 3 people have died following a powerful earthquake in Bangladesh. The 5.7 magnitude quake struck at 10:38 a.m. local time near Narsindi, roughly 33 kilometers from the capital Dhaka, according to the U.S. Geological Survey reports. Authorities are assessing the damage and responding to affected communities.